Hello, this is Sheila Bender, and you're listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today we're talking with Ashland, Oregon writer Molly Bess Tinsley. She's a former professor of English at the United States Naval Academy. She's recognized as the first professor emerita in its history. Her fiction has twice received a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, as well as the Oregon Book Award and the Pushcart Prize. She is the author of Entering the Blue Stone, a memoir from Fuse Publishing, and co-author of Satan's Chamber, also from Fuse, Throwing Knives, Ohio State University Press, and My Life with Darwin, Houghton Mifflin. Dr. Tinsley also co-authored The Creative Process for St. Martin's, and her plays have been read or staged nationwide from Seattle to Houston, New York City, and Washington, D.C. She lives in Oregon, in Ashland, where she divides her time between there and Portland. And today we're going to be discussing her newest book, Behind the Waterfall, a novel. Welcome, Molly.
Thanks, Sheila. Thanks for your interest in my work.
I love your work, and I'm so excited to be able to share it with listeners of KPTZ. I know that Behind the Waterfall is a departure in terms of audience for you. You say it's a young adult novel.
Actually, I'll just qualify that because I thought it was when I started writing, but it's actually a middle grade novel. It's for ages, I think, tops out at about 13, and young adult now refers to more like high school ages.
I see. Well,
So
let me tell you, I loved reading it, so I don't know whether it brought out the middle-aged kid in me or the writer who was really interested in your techniques for telling this story, but I had a really good time with it. And having taught with you and heard your lessons to fiction writers and memoirists, it was really fun to see those lessons in action. So maybe you could tell the listeners a little bit about the history of the book, why you wrote it.
Okay. Well, I have twin grandsons. And a couple of years ago, when they were 11, I was visiting them. They live on the East Coast, and they were complaining that there weren't enough books about twins. So I said, well, maybe we're going to have to write one. And they had a lot of reservations about that. They had sports practices and homework and all this sort of thing. But right then and there, we sat down and started to brainstorm ideas for a book about twins. And their preference was for fantasy. I asked them to describe the kinds of books they enjoyed reading. And we got going on it. When I got back home, I started writing some chapters for them and sent them, and they commented on them. And we went sort of back and forth like that for a while. And then I started to run into a little bit of a, sort of a dead place with the book, and I wasn't sure what was the problem. And I went down to visit my granddaughter, their cousin, and told her I had some concerns about the propulsion of the narrative. I didn't use that word, but I said, I feel like it's kind of boring and slowing down. And she said, well, obviously what these twins need is a kid sister. So I had to go all the way back and write her into the narrative. So that's sort of the way it proceeded in lots of fits and starts. In fact, somewhat closer to what I thought was the end, I actually rewrote the whole thing all over again because I figured out why there aren't more books about twins. And it's because it's very hard to manage point of view when you've got two protagonists. And I had chosen a sort of distant point of view, neutral, and it just wasn't working. It didn't have enough pizzazz. So what I actually did very near the end of the first draft is decide to let the sister, whose name is Sheila, narrate the book. And that required all kinds of changes, as you can imagine.
Right.
I mean, she had to be present in scenes that she hadn't been present for, or there had to be ways that she had the information. And it completely changed the end, because she also had to be older at the time of writing than she had been at the time of action.
You trusted your granddaughter's idea that that sister was necessary.
Yeah.
How old was she at that time?
She was 7 at the time, and the boys were 11.
I see.
She's now 4 years older, and they're 4 years older. Sort of now they're chomping at the bit to get their driver's licenses. Not too interested in reading books, but they were very pleased with the outcome.
As you talk about the difficulties about writing from the twins' point of view, having two protagonists, we're going to be listening to that opening that has to do with the character Sheila and how you managed to change the narration and all that you contend with in doing that. It really shows up in that beginning part. I'm thinking of the Bobbsey twins. I think maybe because that term came up, and I'm thinking it's been a long time since I read the Bobbsey twins, but maybe it would be interesting to look at the issues of writing about twins and how they were solved, because this brings up a very interesting question.
Of course, I think probably the requirements when the Bobbsey twins were popular were much less active, edgy. I think for kids nowadays, you have to have more going on than what went on for the Bobbsey twins.
You know, I don't even remember what went on for the Bobbsey twins. I just remember the term.
Neither do I, actually, and I don't remember the point of view in those stories.
Well, that'll be an assignment that I have after our interview.
Okay.
So why don't we have you read a little bit from that opening?
Okay, I will. Let's see.
Okay, and again, this is the book Behind the Waterfall, a novel.
And I will read from the prologue. And the prologue, as I said, is written by kid sister Sheila, who instead of being the age she was during the action is now 15, the age that her brothers were when the action took place. That's a little hard to wrap your mind around, but it's kind of makes for an interesting cycle by the end of the book. Here's the prologue. Mom was running away. Well, she wasn't really running. She was riding a wobbly old bicycle as fast as it would go along the hot highway out of Bison, South Dakota. And she wasn't my mom or anyone else's mom yet. Even my big brothers hadn't been born. But she was pedaling along, and when I tell you that her eyes stung with sweat and her throat was parched, you're going to wonder how I can know any of this if I didn't even exist. For now, you'll have to trust me if I tell you it's magic. Of course, the basic facts came from her. As for the rest, it's amazing how once you start writing a story, you begin to remember things you never knew before. So this is the prologue, the way back beginning with our not-yet mom all alone on the highway, and Table Rock Mountain off in the distance jutting up from its blanket of trees. Her legs ache to rest, but she pushes on past the paved turnoff. She hasn't lived in Bison long, but she knows this flat-top mountain belongs to a huge mining company, and it is definitely not a safe place to hide. She glances behind to make sure no one is following her. I'll keep on until I drop, she thinks. I'm never going back there, ever. Minutes later, though, she has to stop to catch her breath. As she squints across the plain, a breeze comes up and parts the tall grass like a giant comb, laying it to each side like slicked hair. It seems to offer her a narrow path. Should she? A shrill chorus of yes, yes, yes fills her ears. She walks the bike across a gully and into the crease. The ride feels easier now, even though she's bumping along. She's got her second wind, and she doesn't notice that the trail has started to bend around back toward the mountain. Then the path hits the woods, and it disappears. She lets the bike fall to the ground and strides into the shadowy forest on her long legs. Branches scratch at her bare arms and face, but she must keep going. When she started her ride, she was running away. Now she feels like she's running towards something. She's sure it will change her life for the better. How could she know it would change mine for the worse? And that's how we sort of get the idea, this sort of uh-oh idea.
Right.
That somehow this adventure that Sheila is now going to tell us does not exactly end well.
There's more to the prologue, too, that makes us want to keep reading. And what you were going to say something else about it does not end well.
Well, it does end well in that we are brought back to real time at the end with Sheila writing epilogues. And the first epilogue doesn't work because a new piece of information comes in and she has to write a second epilogue. So it does end happily, but I'm kind of giving things away.
That's okay. But, you know, what's interesting to me is, of course, that Sheila doesn't intend to be a writer exactly, but she is exploring the process of writing and what goes on for a writer. When you read that opening at the weekend we recently taught together, I thought, wow, this is so instructive from the voice of a 15-year-old. We're learning what we have to contend with as writers. So it must have been fun to create her and infuse her with some of the information you know as a writer, which brings me...
she's feisty, too. She has that sort of kid sister, precocious feistiness, which made her, just alone, she brought a lot of life to the book, just adding her in. And then to actually hand her the story to tell definitely increased the energy level. The energy was flagging, about midway through the book. We had our plot points. We pretty much knew how at least the major action would end, but it didn't have the drive that I wanted it to have. And then solving the problem of Sheila, of why is she telling this story when she's 15 and where are her brothers now, that brought in a whole kind of mysterious, almost mystical piece to the plot, to the actual narrative that was never in my mind to begin with. That's the part that I love. I love the fact that eventually the work takes over and you are kind of following it and listening to what it needs to do, and it sort of starts handing you these gifts.
Right. Molly, you say we. You were saying we knew this and we knew that. And I'm thinking, do you mean you and the characters, or you and your actual grandchildren?
Probably a little of both. I actually wound up working more with Risa, my granddaughter, on this toward the end, because I visit her more often, and the boys, as I said, were kind of outgrowing it. I couldn't keep up with their sort of social growth. So in a sense, we has to do with my working with the real-life Sheila.
Oh, that's great. And it's just a wonderful thing that you created this with the three of them, especially with her, and that you taught them a lot about trusting as you write.
The thing they really learned, the boys definitely got this idea, was the messiness of the writing process and the fact that I didn't bat an eye when it was time to go all the way back to the beginning and rewrite it. I mean, they sort of got tired of reading those opening chapters because for them, they knew what, quote, was going to happen next. But I think they understood that it doesn't mean you've done something wrong if it's time to rewrite. I think one of the problems in our school system is that writing is, you sort of hand it into the teacher, and if you wind up having to rewrite it, it means you failed the first time. There's something wrong with the first time. But I think one thing they learned is that the first time is just a rough sketch, and then you begin kind of layering in the details and the depth.
You are listening to KPTZ 91.9 Port Townsend. In case you've just joined us, you are listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today, Sheila is talking with playwright, novelist, and memoirist Molly Tinsley about her newest novel, Behind the Waterfall, and how playwriting, thriller writing, and memoir writing fit into this new book.
A really important lesson for people who want to write is to know that that's not failure. You've got to have something on the page, something you're working with, and then you look into it in the way that you did, about where is it flagging, those kinds of things. So speaking about the way you look into writing, I love when you teach about the fortunate flaw and what you call disturbance. And can you explain that a little bit, especially as maybe it relates to this book?
Just going back a bit, I actually began writing literary fiction when my first novel is what you would call literary fiction. And literary fiction is, as your listeners probably know, is kind of strong on character, strong on language, but not terribly committed to plot, to sort of a series of cause and effects. And I used to call myself structurally challenged. I was all right brain and not very much left brain. And then I began writing plays. When I moved out to Ashland from the East Coast, I'm 10 minutes from the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and I'm in the middle of a theater town. So there is a lot of small theater going on, lots of opportunities to write 10-minute plays and full-length plays as well. I've had full-length plays produced. But with a play, it's just absolutely crucial that your audience knows where things are going. They're not interested in hearing lovely language that's completely unrelated to action and possibly character. One of the lessons I learned in writing plays was I had to let go of my love of language, and the only way I could get it back would be if I had a character who loved language. But otherwise, people had to talk the way they wanted to talk, They couldn't necessarily be poetic. So I learned about structure, and I learned the strategy of structure, and I really had to, because there has to be a reason when people are on stage why they're there. And so I did sort of develop a series of kind of touchstones, I guess, for people who are writing narrative. And one of the most important things is to find the right point of entry into your material. And to find that point means looking for disruption, looking for what I call a disturbance to a pattern. That's how things begin. They begin with once upon a time, and the importance is the once, which suggests the disturbance, something special, and upon the time is the pattern. Things were sort of going along the way they always go along, and then all of a sudden a newcomer comes to town, or all of a sudden a dead body is discovered in the conservatory. There is always that disruption to a pattern to generate the energy that will send a narrative forward.
So how do you see it happening for these three characters, the twins and their younger sister, when the book opens?
The prologue is kind of a cheat, because we see a big disruption to a pattern that actually happened 16 years before. And then we don't understand the implications of that, but the narrative begins to unfold them. In terms of, let's call it real time for the kids, the first disruption is that they're being moved to a new town. Once they're in that new town, there are further disruptions. So there is really a series of shocks to what's going on. One of them is discovering that the twins are turning 15. It's their 15th birthday, and they discover they each have a special power.
So that's definitely a disturbance in the pattern. They're not
disruptive.
Just regular kids.
They are bullied. They are bullied at the school, so there's another disruptive piece. I mean, really, the opening for them is pretty chaotic to sort of launch them onto this journey where actually a number of issues will be resolved, not just the plot, but a subplot.
But I think that I've been told a story opens when something's about to happen. So I think it may be another look into the disturbance. As a reader, I don't feel cheated at all by the prologue. I feel set up, and my empathy goes out to these boys in a new school. I had to go to new schools every few years when I was growing up. I build my empathy when they're dealing with unneeded bullying. They didn't do anything. I'm happy for them when they realize they're special. How would you see the fortunate flaw? And tell us what you mean by fortunate flaw in characters.
That was a really important revelation for me. You know how you know something intellectually. I mean, I've taught English and drama for years and years, and you know the whole thing about the tragic flaw for Shakespeare's heroes, and we all know the idea of a flaw. But to actually understand it as a writer, it took a while for me to absorb that what really gives a character an arc is giving that character a flaw, something wrong, of a character flaw, a problem, a weakness of some sort. And it doesn't have to be sexy. I mean, it doesn't have to be some complicated, one-of-a-kind sort of thing. It can be simply inability to trust other people. It can be over-idealism. You know, idealism can be a flaw, too. I mean, there are all kinds of possibilities that are really quite simple to state, but you have to have one that you hang on to as the creator so that you can show the person struggling with that flaw, probably unconsciously at the beginning, and then having it gradually become conscious such that the action can give the character an opportunity to sort of transcend or overcome or correct, at least temporarily, that problem. The case of a novel written for, say, 10 to 13-year-olds, it doesn't cut very deep. The main flaw is the twins and the fact that they bicker and poke at each other and don't work together. And by the end of the narrative, they are definitely bonded, playing it back to back. Twins are always bonded, even when they're bickering. I mean, the bickering is a bonding ritual, too. But it can certainly gum up the works if you're trying to accomplish something. And that's what happens with them. they are sort of always vying to be the one given this privilege or that particular piece of equipment or whatever, and time is rushing by and time is short. So what you see in them gradually is their ability to work as a team effectively, because they have to get the bad guy.
Right. And so
they have to work together to get the bad guy.
Were your actual grandsons aware? Did they get it? Did they get the lesson?
Yes. But, I mean, we've been telling them that since they were about 8, you know.
Well, maybe reading the story really brought it home. Just like you said, it takes a while to internalize this idea.
I think maybe fighting between siblings who are not twins might be a little more vitriolic, a little bit more meaningful. The fighting between twins tends to be, as I said, almost ritualistic. There's a quality to it like dogs fighting. You've seen dogs fight, and they really don't nip. They just sort of pretend nip at each other. And I think there was that quality in the twins.
Having Sheila in there, where she's the younger sister and the target of some of their barbs, helped.
And also, one of the things that happens over the course of the narrative is that they recognize her as a member of the family with full rights, as opposed to somebody that they call names and think of as booger breath and that sort of thing.
So they're growing. So before this book, you wrote the literary fiction you mentioned. You wrote a memoir. You wrote thrillers and plays. And to me, this book maybe, even though it's for younger readers, kind of folds in all that experience. And I wondered if you might have something to say about that, maybe particularly the thriller aspect.
Yes. No, I think you're absolutely right. It really does. Because I found that writing 2 thrillers actually gave me a lot of experience with that kind of chapter ending that says, you walk into the hotel room and turn on the light and there's a man with a gun, that type of thing. The unexpected surprise at the end of a chapter, the twists, the reversals, I guess is the technical term. So I got familiar with that idea of always thinking in terms of reversing expectations. But at the same time, I was writing from life the way I was in my memoir. The characters are really quite close to the characters I knew. And I also felt a little more free to write more artistically or colorfully for kids. I don't know why that is. I mean, obviously I had to rein in the language a bit, but I didn't rein it in a lot. In fact, I've read middle grade books before and since, and I feel as though they're pitched way too low. At least they're pitched too low for the middle graders that I know. So I think this book is challenging to an 11 or 12-year-old reader.
Well, that makes me feel good because I really liked it, and I'm a long time from 11 or 12 years old. And maybe your grandsons wanted fantasy and the thriller, the combination of something like fantasy in parts with thriller does up the ante in the book and make it a fascinating read.
And I wanted it to have a theme. I really did. I mean, I wasn't going to write for 10 to 13-year-olds without secretly preaching because that's the way I am.
Right, keyword secretly.
And it's my constant, it really is my constant sermon about the importance of the imagination and of the life of the imagination and how the twins and their family are poor. I mean, to put it in one word, they're not wealthy. They live very modestly, even shabbily. And I really think the idea of the life of the imagination and of the mind and of fantasizing is important. Without keeping that life alive, our material lives, I think, become sort of dreary and meaningless. And no amount of money or gadgets or toys can replace a playful mind, a free-ranging mind, an active mind. That is the theme sort of embedded in the book. In fact, the main character, the mystery character named Wedron, that's an anagram for wonder. And his aids, he has a series of aids, and that's an anagram for ideas. And that's the way in which the imaginary realm of foray, which is an anagram for earth, is really earth turned inside out. It's sort of I don't know, I wouldn't use the word spiritual, but just the dreams. The fact that we need to have dreams, we need to imagine, we need to have visions of things.
Right, and it's really cool because as I remember, the kids work out the anagrams towards the end of the book.
Yes, they do.
Yeah, so that's thrilling, really, because they're
And you know
getting
what's really thrilling? A couple of people have written me. They bought a book for a grandchild. In both cases, they said that the one was a girl and one was a boy. They couldn't put it down. They were just so pleased, and they really loved the book. And I was just so thrilled to hear that.
Of course. So we only have a few more minutes, but I want to mention that two things. One is to find out more about you and the book. People could go to Fuse, F-U-Z-E, Publishing.
That's
Correct?
right.
That's
the
place
website of the publisher, fusepublishing.com.
That's the best place to go. And then I want people to know that you're going to actually be up here in Port Townsend teaching in April. I believe it's the April 14th?
No, April 17th, actually.
April 17th. Well,
if that's a Sunday. Yeah, okay. April 17th.
And you'll be teaching about structure in
right.
short
I'm calling
and long.
It Structure to the Rescue.
All right.
Because that's what structure did for me. I think it rescued me.
Right, and it'll be all day on that Sunday, and people can find out about it more through the Writers' Workshop in town. And happily, I'll be teaching the day before, so if people come and create something in my flash fiction and nonfiction class, that's suitable for people to work on with Structure to the Rescue, correct?
Definitely. Anything can profit from structure. And it really,
It's
true. I say that, I've got the zeal of a convert. I really do. I used to think of structure as something static. I don't know why. I thought architectural. I thought building, that type of thing, when really structure is about movement. It's about propulsion.
That is such a good lesson. I think by listening to the program, people are really going to get that idea, and then hopefully some of them who are writing can come to class and learn even more. What a good distinction about propulsion rather than just being static. I wish we could talk on and on and on. We'll have to have a second interview sometime, but our time together is coming to a close, so I just want to thank you again for a wonderful conversation and for telling us how you learned what you learned. And I want to suggest to people that they go to Fuse, F-U-Z-E Publishing, and find out more about your books. I think any kid, any adult would like to read Behind the Waterfall and learn more about keeping that imagination alive. So thank you so much, Molly.
Okay, thank you, Sheila. It's been a pleasure.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman. Announcer is Kurt Vanderslice.